good morning, everyone. Thanks for being with us today. I know we've got a few other people that'll be joining us, but folks may be having a difficult morning, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Thanks for joining us for today's meeting of the Fiscal Policy Study Group. Cheryl Frasca is not with us this morning, and so we're going to carry on, but we do have several board members online. Bernie Smith, Kathy Giesel, and Scott Jepson are with us, and so they'll help me out if I get to that point where I need to call for phone a friend. With us today is Josh Goodman, and Josh is a senior officer with the State Fiscal Health Project at Pew Charitable Trusts. And Scott, sorry, I'm missing my, there we go. I'm sorry. And Josh leads research on fiscal management and place-based economic development programs as a part of Pew's State Fiscal Health Project. He's served as a primary author on studies that examine how states evaluate tax incentives and maintain budget discipline when implementing those incentives. He previously served as a staff writer on State Line, which is another Pew project, and in that role provided daily reporting and analysis on trends in state policy. Before joining Pew, Josh covered state and local government for Governing magazine. And so we're pleased to have Josh with us today. We reached out to Pew to help us consider what the cost of fiscal uncertainty may be. As you know, we've had a number of programs recently focused on the options for a more durable state fiscal plan and how we might change our structures to lead to a more stable fiscal future for the state. And Josh, in his role with Pew, is really in the catbird seat in terms of seeing what states are doing and being able to help us see the picture of other states that have gone before us that have addressed some of these very critical fiscal issues. So with that, I'm going to turn the floor over to Josh Goodman. Josh, welcome.
Thank you so much, Juanetta, and thank you all so much for being here this morning. I'm just going to get my slides up. All right, I think everyone can see those? Okay,
yes.
Wonderful. Let me just start by telling you a little bit about Pew and my project at Pew. Pew is a nonpartisan nonprofit organization, and we conduct research on a whole range of policy issues. My particular project, as Juanetta mentioned, is focused on state fiscal health, and so we're really looking at how can states make their budgets sustainable over time? How can they make sure that sort of whatever their priorities are, they're able to achieve them? And I'm going to talk about three things today. First, how Alaska compares to other states on key indicators in some data that we collect. And I think that'll help contextualize Alaska's budget challenges and some of the causes of those challenges. Then I'm going to talk about the costs of fiscal uncertainty as well as structurally imbalanced budgets. When a state, is struggling to have revenue keep up with spending and is trying to decide what to do about it, what are some of the costs of delaying those decisions and of having a structurally imbalanced budget? And then third, I'm going to talk about some strategies and solutions, especially analytical tools that states are using that can't solve all of their problems by any means, but can inform the solutions that they need to make. So first, why don't I start with tax revenue? And, one of the key features of Alaska's system is obviously the reliance on the oil and gas industry. And one reflection of that is that Alaska has the second highest percentage of its budget come from severance tax revenue, just barely behind North Dakota. And really this chart actually sort of understates, as you know, how much revenue comes from the oil industry because it doesn't account for other types of revenue, such as royalties revenue. And so, along with having sort of a narrow tax base focused heavily on severance tax revenue, Alaska has also experienced declining tax revenue over time. Um, so, in this chart, the orange line is Alaska, the blue line is the 50 state average. And if you look at sort of the national picture, you see in the Great Recession, there's a pretty substantial drop, a very substantial drop in tax revenue across the country. And then a slow sort of recovery that eventually gets revenue back to where it was prior to the recession and beyond. Then you have a sharp drop in the pandemic, and then once again a recovery that happens pretty quickly. Whereas Alaska, you have ups and downs, but this long-term trend with a substantial decline. And Alaska also has, in our data, the most volatile tax system in the country. And this goes along with obviously being dependent on severance tax and having a narrow, not having a broad set of tax revenue sources. What we do with this data is we look at how much does each year on average vary from sort of the long-term trend. So, years above that trend and below that trend, how much is the typical variation? And we take out tax policy changes. So one reason revenue can vary from year to year is that states increase taxes or cut taxes. We remove those policy changes and focus just sort of on the underlying volatility. And as you can see, Alaska actually has a lot more volatility even than states like North Dakota and Wyoming that likewise are focused heavily on extractive industries. And I should say this chart only shows the 10 states with the most volatility and as well the US average. So, if you went farther to the 50 states, you'd see actually much lower numbers. Now, volatility isn't necessarily a problem. It's just that states with more volatility need to be prepared for that volatility. And the best way to do that is to build up reserves so that you can use those reserves in the down years and then rebuild them in the up years. And that can allow government to sort of sustain its operations through up and down years. And obviously, this is something Alaska has really acted on. For most of the last 20 years, Alaska had the largest rainy day fund in the country in the way that we calculate it, which is how many days of government operations could it fund. But obviously in recent years, Alaska has been routinely tapping the rainy day fund. And so now it's behind Wyoming and North Dakota more recently in terms of how much money's in the rainy day fund. And in terms of the years of operations, Alaska's rainy day fund can pay for, it's at the lowest level it has been in the last 20 years at least that we track data. So I suspect all of that gives you a pretty familiar picture of Alaska's finances: a volatile tax system, declining reserves, declining tax revenue. And so these big questions about how do you either adjust spending or revenue to bring things back into balance. And now I want to switch to talking about sort of why that really matters, why it matters for residents, for businesses, for just the state as a whole. And when we see states that are facing uncertainty and that have structural budget problems, there's some practical ways they're affected. And I'll give state examples of each of these of how it's playing out in different or has played out in different places. But they tend to struggle to invest in their policy priorities. Whatever those priorities might be, they lack the sort of margin to be able to invest in them. They tend to struggle in particular with temporary setbacks. So if you have structural budget problems, you add on a temporary shock like a recession or a natural disaster, it's harder for them to deal with those problems. In extreme cases, we see them breaking promises to businesses and residents where they genuinely owe money to people or businesses, and they're just not paying on time. And then finally, they struggle to prepare for future challenges. Every state has long-term challenges, many of which are shared across states, and it's hard to prepare. So I'll start with an example of a state that has struggled to invest in its priorities, and that's Kentucky. And this data comes from a report from the Kentucky Chamber of Commerce called the Leaky Bucket Report. And Kentucky has long-term financial challenges, including a pension system that isn't well funded or hasn't been for a long time, a lot of reliance on one-time money in their budgets. And one of the consequences of that has been that much of the budget goes to areas that really policymakers have limited control. And so you see that over the last 5 years, or this 5-year period, the general fund went up, but some components of that went up a lot more. Medicaid benefits, which are largely outside of the state's control. Corrections, which of course is tied to the size of the prison population. And obviously you can make policy changes in corrections and Medicaid, but there are things that also, there are factors outside of your control. In that other K through 12 education category, which is really the highest there, is retirement benefits for teachers primarily. Meanwhile, the things that the chamber has been emphasizing that the state really needs to invest in, and that other policymakers generally agree, haven't been receiving investment. They haven't had money to invest in higher education or the formula-driven K through 12, which is really the money that gets to schools. And so you have the chamber saying, our biggest economic challenge is our workforce. We need to invest in our workforce. And for Kentucky, it just has not happened. So California is an example during the Great Recession of a state that really struggled to deal with an economic downturn. They had structural budget problems. Then they get into the Great Recession. They're hit really hard. They don't have the reserves they need to deal with that. And so they create what the governor at the time termed a wall of debt. And what he meant by that was a whole series of one-time actions the state had taken to balance its budget, but that actually made the situation worse over the long term. So they were deferring payments to schools, to local governments, to the retirement system. They were borrowing money to pay for operating expenses. They were even pushing off state payroll from June to July, so that, it's just push it into the next fiscal year and then we won't have to worry about it this fiscal year. And so it really took them years and years of work to then pay off the debt from the Great Recession. And similar to Kentucky, that limited their ability to invest in what were their key priorities. And New Jersey and Illinois are examples of when you get into sort of the extreme cases of deeply fiscally challenged states, where people just simply aren't getting paid. And so in New Jersey's case, they had promised tax incentives, actually they were cash incentives, but they'd promised economic development incentives to businesses, and the legislature simply didn't appropriate money to pay for those incentives. For years, actually, that companies were just waiting for the money they were owed. In Illinois' case, they had these deep fiscal problems, and then they struggled to pass a budget at all. And that led to this growth in unpaid bills to businesses and nonprofits that contract with the state. And so this had real consequences. Some of these service providers struggled with their own finances. Some of them were much more reluctant to do business with the state. Some of them scaled back the services they offered in response. Illinois is beginning to get a handle on its financial problems, including making a lot of progress paying down this backlog of bills, but it really took them years to do that. And then there are the long-term structural challenges that every state faces. Even states that would say right now their budget's in a pretty good position. And it's those kinds of challenges that a state that's dealing with uncertainty right now is going to have a harder time dealing with them. And one quantification of those problems comes from the Government Accountability Office. And what they do is they look out 50 years and say, for state and local governments, will revenue keep up with spending absent policy changes? And as you can see, that their forecasts show that gap getting bigger and bigger over time. And I should say these numbers are as a percentage of GDP. So if they were a percentage of state budgets, say, it would actually look like a much more dramatic problem. And in the GAO's analysis, the main cause of this problem is rising healthcare costs. And so for state governments, that's, affects states through higher Medicaid costs, also healthcare for state workers, retirees, and also, the incarcerated population as well. So that's one of the big long-term challenges. And so in addition to healthcare, there are also other factors that threaten long-term budget balance. Changing state demographics with an aging population, that further exacerbates the healthcare problem. It also means you have a smaller percentage of the population that's working age. Other kinds of long-term liabilities like pensions. I know Alaska has a substantial, pension obligation. You have potential costs from more frequent natural disasters. California, for example, is really taking seriously the cost of wildfires now. And then I think especially important for Alaska is economic and technological changes. And so for many states, more fuel efficient vehicles creates a transportation funding problem where states are dependent on gas tax revenue, and if they collect less gas tax revenue because vehicles are more fuel efficient, that jeopardizes transportation funding. I think in Alaska, as all of you know, it's a much bigger problem than just transportation funding, where the future of the oil industry is central to a lot of these conversations in the state. And so no state has the solution to all these problems right now. I think my key point is states need to be dealing with their unique and immediate problems to be able to then turn to some of these problems down the road and make sure they're able to maintain budget balance over the long term. So in doing that, I see two key fiscal goals for all states. And the first is to prepare for the temporary shocks like a recession or a natural disaster, to be ready for those. So you don't have these boom and bust sort of cycles. It doesn't make any sense to hire a lot of workers this year, only have to lay them off next year or something like that. That's what states want to avoid. And then second, to achieve structural balance over the long term, where revenue and spending match, and where you have that wiggle room to be able to invest in your policy priorities, to be able to also meet new challenges as they come up. And so there are a few tools that states can use that in our research are really proven practices to help manage fiscal uncertainty. One, you need data on what the long-term picture looks like. High quality long-term revenue and spending projections. You also need to understand that those projections come with a large margin of error. And so to be stress testing your budgets, where you're looking at both optimistic and pessimistic scenarios and saying, what's the best and worst case scenario, and how can we be ready for that? And you need contingency plans then to plan for those scenarios. So if we have a mid-year budget gap that emerges because there's a quick decline in the economy, what are we going to do to solve that problem? And of course, to solve problems like that, one of the best tools is rainy day funds and other reserves. And so states should be re-examining how much they save in reserves and making sure the savings are accessible when they need it without being too accessible that they're using them, at times that it's not appropriate. So I'm just going to talk through each of these tools a little bit more and give also a few state examples of how states have used them. So what do high quality budget projections look like? And I should say Alaska does have 10-year budget projections. And so that's sort of a step ahead of what a lot of other states are doing. And I think the key thing to be asking is sort of, do they meet these components? If not, what can we do to improve them? So first, you need to be looking at both baseline revenue and spending and potential or upcoming policy changes. So if a tax is going to expire, or if the governor has a proposal to change X and Y, how would that play into the baseline revenue and spending? You need to account for some of those demographic factors and also caseload growth. Is Medicaid enrollment growing? How large is our working age population, and how is that changing? How large is our school age population? And so accounting for those factors can really show whether the budget is sustainable. You need to distinguish between one-time and ongoing revenue and expenditures, so that you're not relying on just one-time money and saying, okay, the budget looks balanced, when over the long term it won't be. You need to account for a range of scenarios, and I'll talk about that more with stress testing, and then being transparent about your assumptions and how different assumptions might change the results. And California is a good example of how these kinds of multi-year forecasts can play into policy decisions and really inform action. And so coming out of sort of the first 6 months of the pandemic, California actually had this large general fund windfall. Like a lot of states, it had a sharp drop in tax revenue, but then a really quick increase, in part because California revenue is highly tied to the stock market, and also because of federal relief factors like that. And because they were looking out multiple years, though, they could see that they still had a large and growing operating deficit. And this really helped color the decisions that the governor and the legislature made, where they recognized that they couldn't just create new ongoing programs with this windfall and expect to be able to afford them in the years ahead. New Mexico is a good example of a state that's doing stress testing to take into account multiple scenarios. And that's really made this a routine part of its budgeting process. And so you can see in this chart, they were looking at the blue line, which was their current baseline expectation for revenue. They were also had in there that gray dotted line, which is their pre-pandemic baseline as a comparison point. But they were also saying, okay, this is what we think is going to happen, but we know there's a ton of uncertainty. So here's what it looks like in different scenarios, upside scenarios and downside scenarios. And states like New Mexico can use that kind of analysis in multiple ways. One, they can use it to set savings targets, saying for those, pessimistic scenarios, how large would they be, and therefore how large should our rainy day fund be? They can design a budget balancing toolkit. So thinking not just about rainy day funds, but what are other options for balancing the budget? Maybe that means revenue increases, maybe it means spending cuts, maybe it means other kinds of budget maneuvers, and planning those ahead so you're ready for one of those temporary shocks. And then this can also inform long-term budget planning. And so if you look at those pessimistic scenarios and say, boy, we're going to struggle to manage this, what are changes you can make to policy to help deal with that? And New Mexico, like in Alaska, there's this big conversation about diversifying their economy and their revenue system. How can we be less dependent just on oil and gas? Finally, there are key rainy day fund policy decisions. As I mentioned with stress tests, there's the question of how large rainy day funds need to be to deal with the problems. But then there are also the questions of the deposit rules, the withdrawal rules, repayment rules, if you have those. And to make sure you're saving enough without saving more than is necessary, and to make sure the money is accessible when the state needs it, but that it's really only using it in years where the money's really needed. So I just wanted to end with a few key takeaways for Alaska. First, Alaska obviously faces unique fiscal challenges in addition to the long-term challenges that are common across states. And structural budget problems ultimately require structural solutions. There's no sort of magic pain-free answer. If revenue isn't keeping up with spending, you either need to increase revenue or decrease spending or some combination of those things. And there are lots of different ways to do it, but that's sort of what's essential to bring the budget back into balance. And as I think the state example showed, delaying action has costs. It makes the problems potentially worse and harder to solve, and it has costs for the economy, for businesses, for residents. And then proven analytical tools can inform the state's decisions. Doing that long-term planning can help you see, okay, how big is the problem we need to solve? How much risk is there in an economic downturn? And the state can then design its response based on that data. So thank you so much for your time and your attention, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Okay, great. Thank you, Josh. I'm going to go ahead and turn off your slides. And I'm going to invite the audience, because we're a manageable size group today. If you want to turn on your cameras, we'll go ahead and take questions live this morning. You can use the chat feature if you'd prefer to ask a question that way, and I will monitor that. I'm going to reach out to my board members online and ask you guys to think of a question. I'm going to start with at least one. Josh, you illustrated what other states are doing, and I was of particular interest, the New Mexico scenario planning. And aside from the process of doing that scenario planning, at least maybe to frame budget decisions, what specific outcomes are you seeing from that? What changes has New Mexico made in terms of its budgeting process or tax structures, or what's the reaction to the scenario planning?
Yeah, so one of the key ways they've used it is to set savings targets. And so they have a number, I think it's something like 25% of annual state spending is what they think they need in their reserves. And so there's a conversation about, they actually have the, good problem to have of thinking now that their reserves might have grown too big and trying to figure out, okay, we have two reserves, we have a little bit of money in this one, we have a lot in this one. The one that has a lot isn't our preferred reserve. So they're rethinking some of those rules about deposit and withdrawal to go along with that. But it's really where it's been really helpful for them is identifying the savings target. How much do we have to save to be prepared for an economic downturn?
Great. All right, thanks. I see Cliff has turned on his camera. Cliff, do you have a question?
Yes, I do. And I have two, and it would really be great. I really appreciate this, and if you could, answer or address both. We'll start out with a more quantitative one. You as a national expert looking at a lot of states. The first question is, does Alaska have the deepest or largest structural deficit as expressed as a percentage of its budget, right? Obviously, California, billions and billions of dollar budget, but obviously big deficits, but much bigger, baseline or budget. And the second one is more qualitative. Does Alaska have the most complicated fiscal politics in the United States? I'm not talking about the policy, right? Permanent fund, oil taxes, both complicated, but politics, fiscal politics, right? So it'd be great, Joshua Goodman, if you could address both of those questions in your role as a national expert looking at states all around our country. Thanks.
Yeah, those are two great questions. So I don't think there's a good comparable estimate of what states' structural deficits are. I think one measure you might use is a state's credit rating, and there are states that are obviously worse than Alaska. So Illinois and New Jersey have, at least in recent years, been the two states with the worst credit ratings. And so like when I talk to people about what are the most fiscally challenged states, usually those would be the two that I would point to first. Kentucky's kind of been down there as well. In terms of complicated politics, I think what we see is there are tough decisions in a lot of different states. And I think Alaska is so distinct that, I think a lot of states would look at your permanent fund and say, this is such a, like, we would envy this. If we had this, we would be in a great position. They would also probably look at your tax structure and say, wow, if we could only have one broad-based tax instead of multiple broad-based tax, like, that would be wonderful. And so I think like, it's a matter of, but there are obviously a lot of moving pieces. And I think the place where maybe Alaska has some of the deepest challenges, both politically and from a structural balance standpoint, is the idea of the industry that's been at the heart of your revenue system being really under threat over the long term. And so, Michigan, for example, in the really first 10 or 15 years of this century, had major problems because of the decline of the US automobile industry. But Michigan, it wasn't like that's the only thing in Michigan. It was just their largest, most important export industry by far. And so, it's hard to find any state that's really comparable to Alaska in terms of having that particular challenge.
Thank you.
Great, thanks. Dan, do you have a question?
Yeah, just a very technical question. The very first slide, what year was that for?
Let's see, the first slide was severance tax revenue.
Yeah.
Yeah, let me just pull that back up and see if I have the data on it. That was fiscal year 2020.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Great, thanks.
And thank you for the presentation as well.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, to amplify maybe a little bit what was said about the permanent fund balance is that I tend to think of Alaska as being somewhat bipolar in terms of fiscal health, is that we have these huge extremes, and particularly when we start thinking about issues with population, changing population, that we do have some shifts. Next week we will be hearing from the state demographer about what some of those changes are coming out of the 2020 census, but now definitely probably being amplified by the pandemic. Josh, can you talk about maybe what states are doing that are seeing those sort of big population shifts? What reactions they might be having to, again, changing their fiscal policies?
Yeah. So I think where our work mostly focuses on is on quantifying, is it a problem? How big of a problem is it? Actually addressing the problem is a whole, other area that's beyond what we get into. But I think there are a few different things to look at. One is the challenge of a shrinking population or a slow growth population is states have liabilities they've taken on. And so will you be able to pay for those liabilities, whether it's pension benefits, whether it's infrastructure? And certainly in the case of shrinking cities, which we also do some work with cities, that's been a lot of their problem is a city can be a perfectly nice city with million people or 500,000 people or 100,000 people or 50,000 people. But if you have the long-term liabilities of a city of 500,000 people, but now you only have 400,000 people, it becomes hard to pay for. And it's also, you know, a matter that different age cohorts affect state budgets differently. And so there are costs from K through 12, there are costs from an older population, especially for long-term care under Medicaid is a large cost for retirees, you know, pension benefits for retirees. So that's where it isn't just sort of how is your population shrinking or growing, but what do these different age cohorts look like?
Barbara Haney's online with us, and she's asking about the openness of economic modeling. The state of Alaska does contract with various consultancies that provide economic modeling, but there's not a lot of transparency. And her concern is, you know, what in terms of economic modeling, what are you seeing other states doing in terms of having something that's peer reviewed and open and transparent to the public?
Yeah, that's a great question. As you mentioned in your intro, part of our work at Pew is actually on economic development tax incentives, and what we've done there is work with states to evaluate the effectiveness of their economic development tax incentives, we don't evaluate them themselves. We help put in place a process in the state to evaluate tax incentives, and that's just a long way to say that we see a lot of economic modeling in those evaluations where they're using REMI and IMPLAN and other different economic modeling techniques. And I think when I talk to policymakers around the country, there's really a lot of frustration with those kinds of tools because of they're not sure about the assumptions that go into them. And I think what I would say is state officials should challenge the people who are doing those models, who are often very smart, diligent, conscientious in their work, about what these numbers really mean. You know, what are the assumptions? If you change assumption X instead of assumption Y, how does that change the results? And so in the tax incentive context, one of the big questions is to what extent the tax incentives influence business decisions. And if you assume they always influence business decisions, then tax incentives will tend to look very effective. If you assume they never influence business decisions, they won't look very effective. And the reality is almost always in between, but how you got into what the right number is in between is really important. So it's that kind of thing that I do think it's kind of on policymakers to demand that those assumptions be made transparent.
Absolutely. I'm going to call out. We've got a number of Commonwealth North board members online, and Nils Andreasen just turned on his camera, which I was hoping he would do, and I'm hoping he's got a question for you. And Nils, floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you. And I guess I was struck by some of your focus on analytical tools, and I know that Pew has produced a number of those. I saw the debt calculator or the interactive tool on debt. I guess when I think about it, the conversation often is, how do we balance our budget? And there's so many other goals to achieve as part of state fiscal policy that analysis is really required. So I'd really be interested in how else can we measure what's important? What's the macro, the micro, the regional, the local, all the different pieces that really should add up to a broader awareness of impacts of state decision-making related to the budget. So I guess analytical tools that you can think of that kind of get to some of those points.
Yeah, that point is very well taken, that if you just want the budget to balance, you could collect $0 in revenue and spend $0 and you have a balanced budget. But states all have policy priorities that they care about, and whether those are achieved or not really is the heart of why states are doing what they're doing. One place we've seen some of this is in that tax incentive evaluation work, where I think there's a growing movement to focus on outcomes for people. So if you're creating jobs, who's filling those jobs? Are they going to local residents or in migrants? Are they going to people across the economics, spectrum, or just are they limited to people who have bachelor's degrees or something like that? And it's not easy to do, but it is, I think, really important. I wouldn't say that we have recommendations on some of the broader things like what is the right way to measure whether your education system is working well or your healthcare system is working well. But I think thinking in terms of who benefits and what your ultimate goals are is really a starting point.
Kathy Kiesel?
Thanks, Juanetta. Josh, thank you very much for this presentation. Very, very helpful. You listed 4 tools. You talked about having long-term data on revenue and spending. This is something that Alaska does attempt to do, but of course, our revenue is coming from oil, and forecasting oil can be difficult, right? Stress testing. This is something that our finance committees are really focused on. We have a very labile past in terms of revenues. We've had crashes, 2009 and 1986. Anyway, they input that data to see what it would look like, what the forecast would look like with those kinds of scenarios happening. So we are doing stress testing. The contingency plan is a difficult piece for our legislature. And then the last thing you said was examining the rainy day funds so that they're not too accessible. Another challenge for our legislature. One of the things that we've been told, and we employ analytic companies such as Cowen, who helps advise our permanent fund corporation. But one of the things we focus on is having 2 to 3 times the annual budget quantity available in those rainy day funds. Is that a solid standard? What are other states looking at in terms of the accessibility of those funds, and how much should be there?
Yeah, so it really ties to the state's unique revenue volatility. And there are states with vastly less revenue volatility than Alaska that require vastly less in reserves. So there isn't, if you look back, say, 10 or 20 years, there's this standard of like 5% that it needed to be 5% of revenue or 5% of spending. I can't remember which one, but I think state officials have gotten smarter since then. And of course, in Alaska, that would be woefully insufficient. And so it's today there's much more focus on, the volatility of your revenue in making those determinations. I think also the spending side is an important piece where, especially if you have an economic downturn, what you tend to have is revenue goes down, but also certain spending demands go up. And so Medicaid enrollment goes up. And so some of the better stress tests are looking at revenue and spending. In Alaska, I have to imagine the revenue volatility dwarfs that spending volatility, but it's still an important consideration as well.
Great, thanks. Any follow-up, Kathy? No, looks like she's
Thanks.
turning off her camera.
No, thanks.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions from the audience? Paul?
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, it took me some while. A little bit of the beginning here for the technical issues, but I just wondered if you talked about any of the economic gain or negativity of the permanent fund, which we have here, very unique for our state, versus expenditures by the state treasurer, and how that would affect our long-term outcomes. Did you do any analysis on the permanent fund versus budget versus expenses? Thank you.
Yeah, that's not something we've looked at specifically. I think there is generally this question within state government, what's better for the economy? Is it returning money to our residents, or is it to invest in programs, and what ultimately benefits us the most? Within that decision, I think the essential part is that you do need a structurally balanced budget to be able to, whether it's, provide, whether it's permanent fund dividends or in other states, tax cuts or other kinds of reimbursements, or whether it's, investing in education, as Kentucky was talking about in that example. It's all really dependent on having a structurally balanced budget as a starting point to do that.
Kathy, did you have another question?
I did, Juanetta, thanks. So Josh, you talked at one point, it was early on, you talked about breaking promises. So one of the reasons that Juanetta had you come and talk was the impact of uncertainty. So you talked about breaking promises, and Alaska's done that. We had cash incentives for drilling, and we eliminated those in 2016 because obviously we couldn't afford them. We couldn't hand out cash, but we are failing to pay the accrued debt on those. And it's not necessarily the legislature that is not appropriating the funds. The governor is vetoing them. But it's my opinion that that's affecting our credit rating, and we're seeing companies very reluctant now to invest in Alaska. Bank of America being one of them, ING, another one. I mean, these are big investors. So what advice would you give? What do other states do in terms of these accrued debts, and how is that affecting uncertainty?
Yeah, there's something interesting in the economic development literature that we talk to states about, which is that businesses tend to heavily discount money that they're promised far into the future. And you see this in a lot of tax incentive deals where a state will say, hey, company X, we're going to give you tax incentives over the next 20 years, something like that. And what the research suggests is beyond just sort of what you would expect from inflation, companies really discount the later years of that money. And the reason for that isn't totally obvious. I mean, part of it might be that businesses don't even know what their business will look like in 20 years, whether they'll be around in 20 years. And so I think that's part of it. But the reason I mention it in this context is I think it's an example that companies really value the money they're offered right now, and if they're not sure they're going to get something, then it's less likely to influence their decisions. And so we've seen some states based on those principles front loading the money they offer, saying, hey, we can actually offer less to businesses, but do it in a shorter time frame and have just as big or as bigger of an impact. So that's one thing some states are looking at. Yeah.
Thank you. We are seeing, as I said, the big investors reluctant to invest in Alaska. I understand there was a large bank or investment group that was going to invest this year, depending on whether the legislature appropriated a small payment into that debt we've accrued for those cash credits. And of course, that didn't happen. Consequently, no investment. It is affecting our economy. It is affecting our fiscal future, certainly jobs. So that's a big deal up here. Thank you so much for your help.
Sure.
Dan, did you have another question?
Yeah, I appreciate what Kathy Giesel just said, and just to follow up on that a little, Josh, I think what the state did is exactly what you said, is they took tax credits that could have been available over 20 years and said, they're transferable, we'll pay you right up front, except when we won't. So my question is, just following up on hers, really is how successful has that strategy been of front loading, and then what happens when you say you're going to front load and don't? Do you have any specific returns on or sense of what's happening out there in the world if other places have had that same problem?
Yeah, so this is something we do sometimes see where there's a large liability built up in a tax incentive, and especially if it's not refundable or transferable, potentially companies might not be able to claim it right away. They might not be able to use it, but it's sort of hanging on in the state's books. And so that's a problem we've seen. And sometimes what states do is they say, well, we'll give you a percentage as either cash or refundable or transferable credits. And so we reduce the state's liability, but you're more sure that you can actually use this money. The details on those kinds of deals, and there haven't been that many of them, those kinds of sort of compromises are really, really important, where we've seen some states, and this is sort of what happened in Michigan, where they try to make a compromise like that, but unless you're really careful about, well, how much will this actually cost us in our first few years, and how does that compare to what we can actually afford, they can make mistakes. So I think your question also goes to the can businesses really trust what the state is saying, which is its own issue and an important one for sure.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Dan. Thanks, Josh. It does. My computer kind of rebooted, I guess, the Zoom session, so I'm not really sure if that was the case for others, but I wanted to revisit something with regard to the rating agencies, because states tend to really trumpet when their ratings are improving. They maybe are not quite so vocal when it turns down. And as I like to say, it only takes one quarter, and sometimes even less than that, for those ratings to change substantially. So it's sometimes a bit of a false sense of optimism may be created by changes from the rating systems. And it hasn't been that long ago that the rating systems themselves, certainly during the Great Recession, where there were significant questions about the efficacy of the rating processes themselves. Now, I do believe that those have improved over time, but economies change, factors that are influencing the future are changing, and sometimes the rating processes don't always keep as close a track on that as one might expect. But at any rate, I just wanted to visit that point. We are coming up on 9 o'clock, so I want to thank you, Josh, for being with us today. Appreciate your analysis and the comparison and the again, I think, as I said earlier, you're kind of in the catbird seat in terms of being able to look at what all states are doing, and that's informative for us. We sometimes get enamored of our own problems and like to admire them a great deal, but it's interesting to see how other states are responding to some of the same challenges, maybe with a different tool set. And so we'll be continuing to look at this question about the cost of fiscal uncertainty. As I mentioned, next week we will be hearing from David Howell, who is the state demographer. We may be joined by another state economist, but the general question that we've asked them is a question that Josh brought up in his analysis, which is you need to take into consideration changing population, the impact that will have on demand for state services, but also revenue streams, potential revenue streams. And so we'll be taking a look at that question next week. And I want to just thank everybody for joining us today. Hope you stay safe. Hope you don't have to be out on the roads today. And we will be posting a recording of today's session along with a downloadable copy of Josh's slide deck. And again, just appreciate you all being here this morning. And thanks again to Joshua for being with us. Appreciate you.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it.
Take care, everyone.